The black maid urged the Mafia boss home. When he arrived, he was stunned. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Victor Callahan was not a man who changed his schedule for anyone, not for associates, not for advisors, and certainly not for staff. His days were measured in minutes, his nights in decisions that could not wait until morning, and his home had long ago become a quiet place he passed through rather than lived in. That was why he stopped walking when Evelyn Brooks spoke. She stood just inside the kitchen doorway, her hands still, her posture respectful, her voice calm, but firm in a way that did not ask permission. She told him he should go home, now. For a brief second, Victor wondered if he had misheard her. Evelyn had worked in his house for 6 years, always punctual, always invisible, always careful to remain within the narrow lines drawn for someone in her position. She did not offer opinions. She did not interrupt. She did not advise a man like Victor Callahan on what he should do with his time. Yet there she was, looking at him without defiance and without fear, repeating herself as if the words carried weight all on their own. Victor studied her face, searching for panic, for gossip, for any hint of drama, but found none. What unsettled him was not the request, but the reason he could not immediately dismiss it. Something in her tone suggested responsibility rather than emotion, as if she were carrying a burden that did not belong to her but refused to set it down. He asked her why. Evelyn did not explain. She only said that if he stayed out any longer, he would regret it, not in the way people usually meant regret, but in the quieter way that lingered. The house around them was immaculate, the lights warm, the clock on the wall ticking toward another late evening, and Victor felt a strange pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with instinct. He left without his usual security detail, telling himself it was efficiency, telling himself it was coincidence, telling himself nothing at all as the car pulled away from the curb. During the drive, Victor replayed the moment again and again, the steadiness of Evelyn's voice, the fact that she had not followed him with explanations or apologies. She had trusted him to decide, and that trust unsettled him more than any warning could have. The closer he got to home, the quieter the city seemed, until the familiar gates opened and he stepped inside a house that felt different without him understanding why. The lights were lower than usual. The air was still, and for the first time in years, Victor Callahan had the uneasy sense that something important had been happening in his absence, something that did not revolve around power or control, but around what he had failed to notice. He stood there, listening, realizing that whatever waited inside, Evelyn Brooks had not spoken to overstep her place, but to protect something he did not yet know he was at risk of losing. Victor Callahan stood just inside the entryway, his coat still on, his phone silent in his hand, listening to a house that no longer felt like a resting place, but like a question he had avoided answering. The silence was not empty. It carried weight, the kind that settled into the bones when something important had been neglected for too long. This house had been built to impress, measured in square feet and polished surfaces, but Victor had never learned its quieter rhythms, the way it breathed when no meetings were scheduled and no guests were expected. He had designed his life around distance, believing that control required separation, and over time, the walls had learned to expect him only in passing. Evelyn Brooks had understood that long before tonight. She understood it the way people did who learned to read rooms instead of contracts, who noticed patterns instead of commands. For 6 years, she had arrived before sunrise, brewed coffee he rarely drank, straightened rooms he barely used, and kept her presence small enough to be overlooked. She had never asked about his work. She had never commented on his long absences. She had never crossed the invisible boundary that kept her safe and employed. To Victor, she had been part of the house, reliable and quiet, like the ticking clock in the hallway he rarely glanced at but would notice immediately if it stopped. That was why her voice earlier had felt so out of place, not raised, not emotional, but certain, as if she had been entrusted with information that did not belong to her yet demanded action anyway. Victor took a few steps forward, his shoes echoing softly on the hardwood floor, noticing details he usually missed: a folded jacket on the chair that did not belong to him, a light left on in the den, a faint smell of chamomile drifting from the kitchen. These were not signs of chaos. They were signs of care. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a realization began to form, uncomfortable and unwelcome, that while he had been managing everything he considered essential, someone else had been managing what he had ignored. Evelyn had not acted out of fear. She had acted out of responsibility, and that distinction mattered more to Victor than he wanted to admit. He remembered her standing there, shoulders straight, eyes steady, not trying to justify herself, not trying to soften the moment with apologies. She had trusted him to do the right thing without explaining why it was right, a kind of trust he had demanded from others, but rarely received without force. As he moved deeper into the house, Victor felt the strange sensation of arriving somewhere unfamiliar that technically belonged to him. It occurred to him that Evelyn knew this house better than he did, not because she owned it, but because she stayed long enough to see what happened when the noise stopped. The thought unsettled him. It suggested that authority without presence left gaps, and that those gaps did not remain empty for long. Somewhere nearby, something shifted softly, not loud enough to announce itself, but real enough to be felt. Victor slowed his pace, aware that whatever waited ahead was not an ambush or a confrontation, but a reckoning of a different kind. He understood now that Evelyn Brooks had not urged him home to disrupt his power, but to remind him that responsibility did not end at the door of the office, and that some consequences arrived quietly, waiting patiently for someone to finally notice. Victor followed the sound with measured steps, past the den and toward the hallway that led to the private rooms, noticing how the house seemed to guide him now, as if it had been waiting for his attention. The light beneath one door was on, not bright, but deliberate, and the sight of it tightened something in his chest he did not immediately recognize. He paused there, listening, aware of his own breathing in a way he had not been in years. This was the part of the house he avoided and less necessary, the part that required more than decisions and schedules. From behind the door came a soft murmur, not a conversation, but a steady presence, the kind meant to calm rather than explain. Evelyn Brooks stood just inside the room, her back straight, her movements careful, doing something Victor had not authorized, and yet could not immediately condemn. She did not turn when he entered. She did not jump or apologize. She simply finished what she was doing, adjusting a blanket, lowering her voice, creating order without asking permission. Victor took in the scene slowly, details assembling into meaning. Papers lay neatly stacked on the desk, not his work files, but forms with printed headings and handwritten notes, dates circled, instructions highlighted. A small overnight bag sat by the wall, modest and practical, the kind chosen by someone who planned ahead without assuming they would be thanked. Evelyn finally turned, meeting his eyes with the same calm certainty she had shown earlier, and in that moment Victor understood that she had crossed the boundary fully, not by accident, but by choice. He asked her what she had done. The question was not sharp, but it carried the weight of authority, the kind that usually caused people to rush into explanations. Evelyn did not rush. She told him she had taken responsibility for what could not wait any longer. She spoke plainly, without drama, explaining that she had noticed things over time, small changes, missed appointments, signs that something important was being postponed because it was inconvenient. She had asked questions where she could, quietly, carefully, and when answers did not come, she had sought them herself. Victor felt the unfamiliar sensation of being briefed in his own home by someone he had never considered a decision-maker. He listened as she explained the calls she had made, the appointments she had scheduled, the signatures she had provided when no one else was available to do it. She did not frame her actions as heroic or defiant. She framed them as necessary. That was what unsettled him most. This was not an emotional plea or a moral lecture. It was a report of actions taken because delay had consequences. Victor looked again at the forms, recognizing names and offices he had delegated and forgotten, realizing that while he had been managing outcomes, Evelyn had been managing time. He asked her why she had not come to him sooner. She answered honestly, saying that she had tried, in ways that did not interrupt, in ways that respected his priorities, but that eventually, respect required honesty, and honesty sometimes required urgency. The room felt smaller then, not because of walls, but because Victor was confronting the reality that authority did not automatically equal attentiveness. He had built systems to handle risk, but he had overlooked the quiet risks that grew in the absence of presence. Evelyn did not ask for approval. She did not ask for forgiveness. She stood there, steady and composed, having already accepted whatever consequences might follow. Victor realized that whatever came next, the balance between them had shifted, not through defiance, but through responsibility exercised when power was absent. Victor remained still as Evelyn finished speaking, not because he lacked a response, but because every response he had learned to use suddenly felt inadequate. He looked again at the documents on the desk, reading them more carefully now, seeing dates that should have been addressed weeks earlier, notes written in a neat, deliberate hand, reminders that did not accuse but quietly insisted. He realized that these were not the marks of someone acting impulsively. They were the marks of someone who had been watching, tracking patterns, and stepping in only when silence became negligence. Victor asked a few measured questions, each one intended to reassert control, and each one answered without hesitation. Evelyn knew the names, the offices, the timelines. She did not embellish. She did not justify. She simply told the truth as it existed, and that truth left little room for argument. As he listened, Victor felt the subtle shift from authority to accountability, a transition he had demanded from others countless times, but had rarely applied to himself. He had believed that providing resources was enough, that delegation equaled responsibility, but standing there, he understood that presence could not be outsourced. The realization did not arrive with anger or shame, but with clarity. Evelyn had not replaced him. She had compensated for his absence. That distinction mattered. Victor moved toward the desk and picked up one of the forms, noticing how his name appeared where a signature should have been, left blank because he had not been there to provide it. He thought about how many decisions he made daily without hesitation, how many risks he calculated with precision, and how this one had been delayed because it did not fit neatly into his operational priorities. He asked Evelyn if anyone else knew what she had done. She answered honestly, saying that she had kept the circle as small as possible, not to hide anything, but to protect what was already fragile. Victor nodded, recognizing the same instinct he valued in people he trusted, discretion guided by purpose rather than fear. He asked her if she understood the position she had put herself in. She said yes. There was no drama in her voice, no appeal for leniency, just acceptance of consequence. That was when Victor felt something tighten and then release inside him. Respect, he realized, was not granted by title or enforced by rules. It emerged when someone acted correctly in the absence of instruction. He walked to the chair near the bed and sat down slowly, an action that surprised them both. It was the first time he had sat there in a long while, the first time he had placed himself at eye level with the situation rather than above it. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because Victor was finally occupying it fully. He asked Evelyn to stay for a moment, not as an employee receiving orders, but as someone who had knowledge he needed. She stayed, standing quietly, allowing him the space to process without filling the silence. Victor understood then that this was the decision point, not one that required an announcement or a command, but one that required alignment between power and responsibility. He had been urged home not to be confronted, but to be present, and in that presence, he was beginning to see the cost of what he had overlooked and the quiet strength of the person who had refused to let that cost be paid in silence. Victor remained seated longer than he intended, the weight of the moment settling in as the room revealed what his absence had concealed. The truth did not arrive all at once, but in quiet details that connected themselves without argument. A soft cough from the bed drew his attention, and for the first time that night, Victor truly looked. His son lay resting beneath the covers, smaller than Victor remembered, his breathing steady but careful, as if each breath had learned to conserve energy. The sight struck Victor with a clarity that no report ever had. This was not an emergency that announced itself loudly. It was the kind that grew patient in silence. Evelyn stepped slightly aside, allowing Victor a clear view without stepping forward herself, as though she understood that this was a realization he had to reach alone. He stood and approached the bed, lowering himself enough to see his son's face clearly, noticing the faint lines of fatigue that had gone unexplained for too long. Victor felt the unfamiliar sting of recognition, not fear, but accountability. He turned back toward the desk and read one of the medical summaries fully this time, not scanning for outcomes, but absorbing the language. The condition was manageable. The recommendations were clear. The risk lay not in severity, but in delay. Victor exhaled slowly, understanding the full weight of what Evelyn had prevented without ever naming it as heroism. She had not saved anyone dramatically. She had simply refused to let neglect continue quietly. He asked when the appointment had been made. She told him the exact date and time. He asked who had authorized the tests. She answered honestly that she had, because waiting for authorization had become the problem. Victor closed his eyes briefly, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. The turning point did not come with raised voices or declarations. It came when Victor sat down on the edge of the bed and gently adjusted the blanket himself, a simple act he realized he had not done in years. In that motion, something irreversible shifted. He understood that the life he had built was precise and efficient, but incomplete, and that completeness required presence, not just provision. Evelyn watched quietly, ready to step back into invisibility if commanded, but Victor did not look at her as staff anymore. He looked at her as someone who had held responsibility when he had not. He asked her what else he had missed. The question surprised them both. Evelyn answered carefully, choosing honesty without accusation, mentioning routines, subtle changes, moments when support had been needed without announcement. Victor listened without interruption, absorbing the reality that leadership failed not when challenged, but when unattended. The room held a new stillness, one that felt resolved rather than tense. Victor knew this was the point of no return, the moment when ignorance could no longer be claimed. He had been stunned not by betrayal, but by devotion he had not earned. As he stood there, the house no longer felt like a place he passed through. It felt like a responsibility he was finally prepared to inhabit. Evelyn did not wait for instruction. She simply stood, composed and ready, having already done what mattered most. Victor understood then that power revealed character not when exercised loudly, but when corrected quietly, and that tonight, the correction had come from the least expected place. The night moved forward without ceremony, and Victor stayed, not out of obligation, but because leaving no longer felt acceptable. He made a few quiet calls from the hallway, not the sharp, directive conversations he was known for, but careful instructions that emphasized timing and follow-through rather than urgency. When he returned to the room, Evelyn was seated in the chair near the wall, hands folded, waiting without expectation. Victor realized then how accustomed she was to waiting, how patience had become both her shield and her strength. He told her the arrangements he had confirmed, the follow-up appointments, the adjustments to schedules that would remove uncertainty rather than postpone it. Evelyn listened attentively, nodding when details aligned with what she already knew, correcting him gently when something required clarification. There was no challenge in her tone, only precision. Victor accepted the corrections without defensiveness, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed by either of them. He understood now that leadership in this moment did not mean asserting control, but restoring trust. He asked Evelyn how long she had noticed the changes. She answered truthfully, explaining that patterns revealed themselves slowly, in routines that no one thought to question. Victor absorbed this, recognizing the cost of his own distance. He had assumed that silence meant stability, not realizing that silence often meant adaptation by those who had no authority to demand attention. The room settled into a calm that felt earned rather than forced. Victor sat again, this time closer, not to dominate the space, but to share it. He watched his son rest, noting the small signs of comfort that came from consistency, something Evelyn had quietly provided long before tonight. He asked her what she needed going forward. The question surprised her, and she took a moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. She did not ask for recognition or reward. She asked for clarity, for communication, for assurance that concerns raised would be heard before urgency made them unavoidable. Victor nodded, understanding that what she requested was not power, but partnership within clearly defined limits. He agreed without hesitation, realizing that this agreement marked a deeper change than any formal decision he could announce. The house felt different now, not because it was quieter, but because it was aligned. Evelyn stood when he did, ready to return to her duties. But Victor asked her to stay a moment longer, to continue speaking plainly if she noticed something he overlooked again. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching, and agreed. In that exchange, unspoken but clear, Victor acknowledged the truth that responsibility had been upheld not by command, but by conscience. He understood that respect had shifted direction quietly, not upward or downward, but inward, reshaping how he saw his own role. As the night deepened, Victor felt a sense of resolution that did not announce itself loudly, but settled into place. He had been urged home to witness the cost of absence and the strength of quiet action. The lesson was not dramatic. It was enduring. And as Evelyn moved calmly through the room, restoring order without drawing attention, Victor recognized that dignity did not demand acknowledgement. It revealed itself through care taken when no one was watching. Morning arrived without ceremony, filtered through the tall windows and soft bands of light that made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a place where time could slow down. Victor had not slept much, not because of worry, but because awareness had replaced habit, and awareness was louder than any alarm. He moved through the kitchen quietly, noting how Evelyn had already arranged the space, the coffee prepared exactly as he preferred, even though he rarely noticed, the table set with an order that suggested care rather than routine. She did not greet him with explanations or questions. She simply acknowledged him and continued, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred the night before. That restraint struck Victor more deeply than any speech could have. There was no triumph in her posture, no expectation of gratitude, only consistency. Later that morning, Victor made decisions that would normally have been delegated without thought. He adjusted schedules himself, delayed meetings that could wait, and made space where space had never existed before. No one questioned him. No one needed to. The authority was still his, but it moved differently now, quieter, more deliberate. When he returned to the room, his son was awake, alert in a way Victor had not seen in months, responding calmly to the familiar routine Evelyn maintained. Victor sat nearby, not intruding, simply present, learning the rhythms he had ignored. The silence in the room was not empty. It was purposeful. Evelyn moved with efficiency, checking notes, ensuring comfort, and then stepped back, allowing Victor the space to engage without instruction. He did not ask her to leave. He did not need to. The justice that unfolded that day did not arrive through announcements or consequences imposed on others. It arrived through alignment. Victor recognized where responsibility had been carried alone and where it should never have been. He did not raise his voice or summon anyone for reprimand. Instead, he removed obstacles quietly, corrected systems without blame, and ensured that attention replaced assumption. Those changes rippled outward, subtle but undeniable, felt more than seen. Evelyn noticed, not because she sought recognition, but because consistency responds to consistency. As the day progressed, Victor found himself observing rather than directing, absorbing rather than instructing. The house functioned smoothly, not because it feared him, but because it trusted the structure now being honored. When Victor finally spoke to Evelyn later that afternoon, it was not to issue orders or offer praise. He simply acknowledged that what she had done mattered. The words were brief, understated, and sincere. Evelyn accepted them with a nod, not diminishing their weight, but not leaning into them either. That balance was the quiet justice of the moment. No hierarchy was announced as overturned. No roles were dramatically redefined. And yet, everything had shifted. The house breathed differently. Victor understood that power had not been challenged, but refined. Respect had not been demanded, but earned through humility. As evening settled in, Victor remained, choosing presence without performance, recognizing that dignity revealed itself most clearly when no audience was watching. The silence held, not as tension, but as understanding, and within that understanding, the lesson endured, unspoken and unforced. The days that followed did not announce themselves as change, yet change settled into the house with quiet certainty. Victor Callahan adjusted his routines not with speeches or directives, but with presence that no longer felt temporary. He returned earlier in the evenings, not always to intervene, but to observe, to listen, to notice the small consistencies that made stability possible. The staff sensed the difference immediately, though no one spoke of it aloud. Schedules became clearer. Decisions arrived before delays could grow into problems. Responsibility moved closer to where life actually happened. Evelyn Brooks continued her work as she always had, measured and composed, but there was a subtle shift in how her voice carried weight. When she spoke now, it was not because urgency demanded it, but because clarity invited it. Victor asked for her input at times, not as a gesture, but as a practical acknowledgement that she saw what others overlooked. She offered her observations without embellishment, keeping her focus on outcomes rather than recognition. That balance reinforced what had already been learned. One afternoon, Victor made a decision that surprised those who expected dramatic gestures. He reviewed the structure that had allowed important matters to be postponed indefinitely and quietly dismantled it. He reassigned responsibilities, not as punishment, but as correction, ensuring that accountability aligned with proximity rather than rank. No names were raised. No scenes were created. The effect was immediate. Systems adjusted. Communication improved. The house functioned with a steadiness it had not known in years. Evelyn noticed the changes not because they favored her, but because they reduced the need for silent intervention. That reduction mattered more than any reward. Victor never offered Evelyn a grand thank you or public acknowledgement. Instead, he ensured that she no longer had to choose between conscience and position. Her role remained defined, but her concerns were given a clear path upward, no longer dependent on timing or courage alone. That was the justice of it. Quiet, structural, lasting. In the evenings, Victor often sat nearby while his son followed familiar routines, watching how calm was built through predictability rather than control. He saw how Evelyn's presence provided continuity, not through authority, but through attentiveness. The realization reshaped how Victor viewed strength. It was not in domination or decisiveness alone, but in the willingness to be corrected without resentment. As the house settled into this new rhythm, something else shifted as well. Evelyn no longer moved as if the floor beneath her might change without warning. The security came not from promises, but from consistency proven over time. Victor understood then that dignity was not restored through gifts or praise, but through environments where integrity did not require sacrifice. On a quiet evening, Victor stood in the kitchen, watching Evelyn prepare the space for the next day, her movements unhurried, assured. He realized that what had stunned him that night was not her action, but the mirror it held up to his own absence. The consequence of that realization was not guilt, but responsibility finally claimed. The justice that followed did not announce itself loudly. It lived in the calm that replaced tension, in the trust that no longer needed courage to survive. And in that calm, the house became not just a symbol of power, but a place where care and authority finally stood on the same ground. Time settled into the house with a steadiness that no longer felt borrowed. Victor Callahan moved through his days with a different measure now, one not defined by urgency, but by attention. He noticed things that once passed unseen, the way his son laughed more easily, the way routines created confidence, the way calm could be maintained without force. None of it required announcements. It required presence. Evelyn Brooks continued her work with the same quiet discipline she always had, her dignity intact not because it had been defended loudly, but because it no longer needed defense. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees and the house softened into familiar shadows, Victor stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched Evelyn set the table. The scene was ordinary, almost unremarkable, and yet it carried the weight of everything that had changed. He realized then that nothing dramatic had been added to his life. Instead, something essential had been restored. He spoke her name, not sharply, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. Evelyn looked up, meeting his eyes without hesitation. Victor thanked her, simply, without elaboration. There was no speech, no attempt to frame the moment as redemption or gratitude owed. It was a recognition, clean and unburdened. Evelyn accepted it the same way she accepted responsibility, with composure and without expectation. After that, there was no need for further explanation. The house functioned as it should, not because of authority asserted, but because of trust maintained. Victor understood now that leadership did not reside in being obeyed, but in being accountable when others had carried the weight in silence. He did not change Evelyn's role in ways that would draw attention or commentary. Instead, He protected the space in which her integrity could exist without risk. That protection was the truest form of respect he could offer. As the days continued, Victor found that the power he once wielded reflexively now carried intention. He listened before deciding. He stayed when he might have left. He learned that restraint could be strength, and humility could stabilize what force never could. Evelyn moved through the house with assurance, not elevated, not diminished, simply recognized. There was no celebration of what had been corrected, because the correction itself had become part of the structure. One quiet night, Victor sat alone for a moment after the house had settled, reflecting on the moment he had been urged home. He understood now that the shock he felt was not fear or surprise, but recognition of a truth he had avoided. Dignity had been upheld by someone with no obligation to do so, and power had been reminded of its responsibility. That understanding did not fade. It shaped his choices going forward, anchoring them in awareness rather than assumption. The house no longer felt like a symbol of what Victor controlled. It felt like a place where values were lived quietly, without display. And in that quiet, the lesson endured. Respect was not taken or given ceremoniously. It was earned through humility. And that day, without witnesses or applause, the world remembered what dignity looks like.